Right, hey guys, how are we doing? Back on another video from Ham on Beat. We've got another debunking Araki forgot extras video. So same rules apply. If it gets up to after Stone Ocean, I will be stopping the video. I've got Volume 1 of Steel Ball Run pre-ordered on Amazon. I'm very excited to get it actually into that later this year. So, you know, in the future, who knows, I can go back to certain things. But for now, let's see what we got.
Kishibe, I'm on the beat.
Welcome back to another installment of Debunking Araki Forgot Extras, where I answer your questions about the JoJo series. I recently reached 300,000 subscribers, so I'd like to celebrate by starting to put out some more videos. And it's been quite a while since the last extras, so hopefully I've been able to put together a good list of topics.
Sick.
Our first topic comes from part 1. They ask how Zeppeli knew Jonathan's name in their first meeting. While it's not directly stated, Zeppeli's dialogue does give us an easy clue for how he would know this. When introducing himself to Jonathan, Zeppeli mentions having overheard Wang Chan talking about the fire at the Joestar Manor.
Oh, so in that conversation, it could have maybe mentioned his name.
And that he disappeared soon after. We know that the reason for that disappearance was Wang Chan finding the stone mask in the rubble and being converted by Dio. Zeppeli investigated the incident and concluded that the mask was involved, so he sought out Jonathan. Jonathan was the son of a well-known noble family, so finding out his name wouldn't actually be hard for him.
Okay, right, fair.
In fact, we see from the end of part 1 that Jonathan's marriage to Erina was reported in the newspaper. So the mansion fire and the fact that Jonathan is now the sole survivor of the Joestar family likely would have also been written about. For the next question, this person says that the Pillarmen seem to have been around at the same time as the Aztecs, but that shouldn't be possible since the Pillarmen went into hibernation sometime during the Roman Empire, centuries before the Aztecs. This is a bit of a misunderstanding since it was never actually said that the Pillarmen interacted with the Aztecs. Pillarman society existed far in the past, but the only thing that was said about their interaction with humans was that humans worshipped and feared them as gods. The Aztecs in JoJo were not the same humans described back then. They simply discovered the stone masks that were left behind, which led to the fall of their society. The manga itself actually lists out the dates for this, so those two events are clearly meant to be separate.
Right.
The next comment has to do with the fight between Wamu and Caesar. They ask why Wamu didn't just turn into stone like Santana when exposed to light from Caesar's bubble lenses. Well, I just don't see how that would make sense for him to do in this fight. Santana turned to stone as a last resort to save himself, but this leaves him unable to attack, which let him get sealed away forever. Wamu is smarter than that and clearly wasn't willing to give up. His goal was to defeat Caesar, which he did by instead waiting for the right time, letting him activate wind mode and blow the lenses away. The next question deals with part 3 in the fight with the stand Yellow Temperance. They start by asking how the stand was able to use Hierophant Green and why it didn't just instead use Star Platinum to fight Jotaro. I actually covered this years ago in my original part 3 debunking video. The answer is pretty self-explanatory since the whole point of Yellow Temperance is that it's a blob that can take the appearance of anything. So in this case, it took the shape of Hierophant Green to fit with the Kakuin disguise. Now you can see why the second part of the question doesn't make much sense. Yellow Temperance doesn't match the power of things it turns into, it just has their appearance.
Right.
So while it could turn into Star Platinum, that wouldn't actually help it in any way since it wouldn't have Star Platinum's strength and speed. The better strategy, which Rubber Soul uses here, was to be wrapped in the stand since the blob itself is indestructible and can absorb attacks to digest the enemy. For our next one, we have a question related to Dio's flesh buds. They ask why it was necessary to use Star Platinum to remove the flesh buds when Joseph using Haman on them could have simply destroyed them while inside the host. This is a question I've seen for quite a while now, but honestly it just completely slipped my mind as to whether I had already covered it. One of the reasons for that is that it's another one of those very common but very easily explained questions. Joseph specified that if the flesh bud was disturbed in some way, it would thrash around in the brain and kill the host. Using Haman would destroy the flesh bud, but the bud would no doubt respond to
kill the person,
that and endanger Kakuin. So the only thing that could safely remove the bud was Star Platinum's extreme precision. This next question deals with the runaway girl, also known as Anne. They ask how it was possible for Anne to get ahead of the others before the Wheel of Fortune fight. Well, if we look back at the series of events, this is actually very plausible. The last time we saw Anne before this was when she followed the Crusaders on their train to India. Once in India, the group were stuck for a bit fighting Whole Horse and Jay Guile, immediately followed by Empress. So in that time, Anne moved ahead and was able to meet them again near the border to Pakistan. This next person asks how Enya was able to know when stand users other than her son were killed. Obviously, with her son being connected to her through a psychic link, we saw that she shared injuries with him and determined that he was dead. But the same would not be true for the other stand users. This one has a couple explanations. First of all, we shouldn't forget that Enya is a fortune teller and can simply divine the answer. But they also still have a much more direct way of learning this. Dio was shown to be spying on the Crusaders with Jonathan's stand, so the things happening along their journey are just shown directly to them. For our next comment, we move on to the fight with Cameo, the user of the stand Judgment. They ask how Cameo knew what Polnareff's sister looked like to be able to make a copy of her. This is another pretty simple one, since we can see that Polnareff actually shows him a picture of Sherry as he makes this wish.
That's funny. That's great.
This next one deals with
Literally
a line
showed
from
him.
Dio near the end of part 3. They point out how Dio says that when he was younger there were only horse-drawn carriages, but that this was contradicted by part 1 itself, which includes a scene of Speedwagon riding in a car. Now, I do have to give props for remembering this scene, since this moment actually got cut out of the anime.
So it's
But
manga
this is
only.
actually another very simple question to answer. The scene with the car in Phantom Blood takes place in 1888, which is a couple years after the first automobile was patented. However, Phantom Blood started before then, when Jonathan and Dio were kids, which was in 1881.
Right.
So like Dio says, when he was younger, there were no cars. And regardless of that, cars were still not widespread until sometime after Dio
Fair
entered the
enough. Cool.
coffin.
Yeah, it's just about
In the
time.
last
then,
video, I
suppose.
went over the final fight with Dio and how Jotaro was able to kill him with a punch from Star Platinum. There I mentioned that Dio's leg had been weakened, which is why the strong punch was able to have such a big effect on his stand. I got some comments, however, pointing out that the actual reason for this was because the left side of Dio's body was weaker, as he demonstrated for Whole Horse. However, this is not what happened here. As Dio said, Jonathan's body was rejecting him and he needed Joestar blood to gain control. But this was no longer a problem for Dio, since we saw that he took Joseph's blood and became stronger. Another person says that this must be the reason for Dio's defeat, and not the fact that Jotaro injured his leg, since Dio kicked with his left leg when Jotaro had only broken his right. This is untrue, since as we can see, Jotaro actually broke both of Dio's legs.
Yeah, look at them.
If we look at the fight a bit deeper, this is all explained more clearly. After Jotaro broke Dio's legs, he said that he didn't want to kill Dio while he was helpless, and would wait for him to regenerate. But instead of waiting and having a fair fight with Jotaro, Dio tried to blind Jotaro with his blood.
Just so bad.
This
Just
is why
squeeze
when
it out
they
of his
clashed,
leg.
Dio was
Such
weaker, since he was
JoJo's.
overconfident and didn't wait to be healed.
Such
Next
a
is a
JoJo's
question
thing
from
to
part
do.
4 related to Kira's introduction. This comment asks why when Kira was hiding from the group in the gym that he used a coat hanger to grab the sandwich bag instead of just using his stand. Now I feel like this is a pretty easy one to answer, since using Killer Queen here would be a dead giveaway to a stand user.
Yeah, they'd all see
Now,
it.
while Kira didn't know that the protagonists were stand users, he does know that other stand users
Are
exist,
around, yeah.
and wouldn't risk exposing his stand in such an obvious way. Whereas for the coat hanger, he was able to attempt to grab the bag while still remaining unseen. Our next one is about the scene where Yoshihiro Kira's picture is pinned to the wall. This comment says that Okuyasu only placed pins around 3 of the 4 sides of the photo. However, when we see the photo later, all of the sides have holes on it. This is another really simple one. If we take a closer look at the scene, we can see that the photo was actually folded in half when the pins were placed in it. So when unfolded, the pins will actually be on the borders around all the sides. Next is a
That's
question
true,
about
actually,
the
yeah.
stand
Huh.
cheap trick. They ask why cheap.
Yeah, because it's going through both sides of the picture.
Trick was trying to help Kira when he seemingly wouldn't know them. And if he did know them, Rohan should have been able to read about it with Heaven's Door. Now this one is a bit tricky since we have to deal with the difference between Cheap Trick and its user. The user of Cheap Trick, Masazo Kinoto, isn't aware that he has a stand, and we see that Cheap Trick itself acts on his own. Cheap Trick follows Yoshihiro's instructions just like any of the other stand users awakened with the arrow, but the user itself was unaware of this. So this is why Cheap Trick wanted Rohan to destroy the photos of Kira. The question also asked why Rohan didn't read about this, but since Kinoto is separate from his stand, his book said nothing about it, only that he had an unconscious fear of people seeing his back. And for the stand itself, Rohan was incapable of reading it, since while Cheap Trick was on him, trying to use Heaven's Door on it would also affect himself. Next is a question about the Thus Spoke Kishibe Rohan chapter, Hot Summer Martha.
Okay.
They say that the chapter was too confusing, with Rohan entering a relationship with a fan in an alternate timeline despite that being against his character. And then once he returns to his timeline, he doesn't even seem to go back to the right time. These aren't really contradictory at all, of course, and everything makes sense if we take a closer look at the chapter. For starters, there is no other timeline at work. What happened in the story was that Rohan found a mirror in an ancient tree, and after being reflected in it, he was replaced with a being known as the Yabubako Hoshi.
Okay.
This is a yokai that acts like a doppelganger and takes over your life. For Rohan, this happened in an instant, but in reality, 3 months had passed. In that time, the other Rohan started a relationship with Rohan's fangirl Eve, and Rohan notices that his newest manga chapter is censored. However, to say that this was against Rohan's character is entirely missing the point, since he wasn't the one that made these decisions.
Actually
it was the
him.
yokai, which was said to act like a darker version of yourself. Later, Rohan was told that if you turn the mirror around without being reflected in it, then the actions of the Yabubako Hoshi will be overwritten. At the end of the chapter, Rohan is able to accomplish this using Heaven's Door and Eve. So Rohan was never sent to another time. At the end, all time has still passed. He simply cancelled out the actions of his doppelganger. The comment seems confused about the ending as well, since the changes to Rohan's work are still in place. However, this was the entire point, and the chapter's final twist, that his editor Izumi was actually the one to change it, and not his doppelganger, which is why it remains the same.
Right.
For another Rohan question, one I've seen a few times asks how Rohan was able to use Heaven's Door on himself in Hot Summer Martha, when he previously stated that he isn't able to use it on himself. However, this is incorrect, since Rohan has never actually said that he's immune to his own stand. First, let's look back to the times this has been covered in the manga. The main scene that I believe people are referring to here comes from when Rohan visited Reimi's grave. Here he learned about their past together, which Rohan had suppressed the memories of. At the end, Rohan says that he can't read about memories blocked from his mind or his own fate. I have seen people try to take this to mean
So they
that
interpret
Rohan
it
can't
as
use the
that,
stand on
right.
himself, but this isn't exactly what is being said here. I'm pretty sure he's actually talking about when he used his stand on Reimi. Since Rohan had suppressed the memories of their past, his stand was not able to make those words appear in Reimi's book, which is why Rohan just thought she was a normal girl. On the other hand, it could still be interpreted that Rohan is talking about his own book here, since he mentions that he can't read his own fate. But that still doesn't rule out being able to read himself at all, just that what he reads would be limited, just like it is for everybody else. The other example comes in the fight with Cheap Trick. Rohan tries to use Heaven's Door on the stand to remove it, but because Cheap Trick was inhabiting him, it caused him to be affected by his own ability. Here, Cheap Trick says he's a manifestation of Rohan's psychic energy, which means he's attacking himself with his stand, and his stand doesn't work on himself. This is a more direct quote to use against the idea of Rohan being able to manipulate his own book. However, I believe this is a mistranslation. First of all, it doesn't make much sense for Cheap Trick to say Rohan's ability doesn't work on himself when we see that Rohan does in fact turn into a book.
Yeah.
If we take a look at the official English release of the manga, Cheap Trick instead says, "You're attacking yourself with your own stand and it's not working out for you, wouldn't you say?" So rather than Cheap Trick saying that Rohan's stand doesn't work on himself,
he's literally
actually
saying
that
is.
Rohan's attack isn't working because whatever he tries to do to Cheap Trick will also happen to himself. Now we move on to part 5. This person mentions how in the fight with Black Sabbath, Koichi said that Pulpo probably didn't even know that a fight took place since Black Sabbath is an automatic stand. However, back in part 4, in the fight with Sheer Heart Attack, Kira still felt the effects of Echo's Act 3 despite the stand being automatic. Once again, a very simple answer, since in the scene where Koichi mentions this, he actually does say that Pulpo could have felt himself get heavier from the gravity. For Pulpo though, that wouldn't seem like much of a difference and he would have no idea a fight took place. This next one deals with a fight with Babyface. They ask how it was possible that dealing damage to Babyface killed Malone when the stand was actually just the creation of Malone's real stand, which was the laptop. This comment seems to be confused since this is not what happened at all. As we can see throughout the fight, Malone shares no damage with the stand, and when it was destroyed, he was perfectly fine. He even said that since he had Bucciarati's blood, he was just going to make another Babyface and continue attacking. The thing that actually defeated Malone was Giorno turning Babyface's corpse into a snake, which returned to its user and killed him. Next is a comment asking how Diavolo survived the fight with Risotto since he never got back his iron after it was taken from him. Again, a very simple answer since this was directly explained. Diavolo replaced his lost iron by taking the blood of the things around him, which he did by eating a frog and then by taking the blood of one of the nearby children. Then we have a couple questions about an apparent contradiction in the origin of the stand arrows. First, they say that in Part 4, it was said that the stand arrow was made from a meteorite that crashed into Earth, but that in Part 5, the story was changed and no longer mentions the meteorite. Now, I'm not sure what this guy is talking about since, as I'm sure most of you watching already know, this is not true. The stand meteor was not mentioned whatsoever in Part 4, and the origin of the stand arrow was left as a total mystery, other than the fact that Enya and Dio had possessed them. It isn't until Part 5 that the stand meteor was mentioned to begin with, and obviously the origin did not change at all after that point. Their next question deals with the amount of stand arrows. They say that at first there only seemed to be a few arrows, but that later parts introduce more without any explanation. Now, we already know this guy doesn't have a particularly good memory when it comes to the stand arrows, so it isn't a surprise that this is also wrong. I don't really see how more arrows appeared without an explanation when the part that introduced more arrows is the one that gave them an origin to begin with. Not only that, but the backstory we got shows that Diavolo discovered 6 arrows in Egypt. Not only is that enough to account for every arrow we see in the series, it actually leaves one extra. So there was never any confusion as to how arrows appear later on.
I love how he words things sometimes. It's so
this one
funny.
asks how the stand Anubis could be 500 years old when the stand meteor landed less than 500 years ago. This is also not true. In Part 5, Polnareff explains that the stand meteor fell tens of thousands of years ago. When exactly the arrows were made from the meteor is what we don't know. Polnareff first states that it was hundreds of years ago, but goes on to say that we don't know how long it was. I think it's safe to say that they were probably made a long time ago by a more primitive society. Remember that the arrows resurfaced in the modern world when Diavolo discovered them in Egypt in 1986, meaning that sometime after the arrows were made from the meteorite in Greenland, they then made their way all the way down to Egypt and ended up in an ancient ruin.
And then locked
I
away,
think
yeah.
that process would no doubt take a very long time and definitely places the creation of the arrows back in ancient times. So Anubis existing isn't a problem here whatsoever. Regardless, this may not be an issue at all since we don't know if Anubis's creation had anything to do with the arrow to begin with. As we know, people are capable of being
Some do naturally have it, yeah.
or awakening them in other ways without ever having come into contact with the arrow. This is because the potential for stands does not originate from the arrow like some think. The potential already exists within humanity, and the arrow is just one method to force it out. Now we move on to Part 6 with a question about the fight against Manhattan Transfer. Here they point out how Pucci's plan was to allow Jotaro to witness Manhattan Transfer's ability in the dream, so that when Jolene was attacked later, he would be distracted in order to steal his discs. They ask how this is possible since we saw the stand in Jolene's dream, not Jotaro's. This whole series of events is pretty convoluted, but the implication seems to be that to a certain extent Jolene and Jotaro occupy the same dream. After all, what's being shown to them is not a literal dream, but an actual illusion created by Whitesnake. In the early stages of the fight, we see events that Jolene couldn't possibly be seeing if this were her dream alone, like Star Platinum stopping time to remove the bullet, as well as Jotaro's own inner monologue. So at this point, Jolene and Jotaro are both seeing the same thing, and this is when they learn about the stand's ability. The point where it becomes only Jolene's dream is when she goes off on her own to find Emporio and goes through the non-existent secret passage, since the Jotaro that appears there is an illusion, and the real Jotaro later has no knowledge of Emporio. Once Jotaro finally wakes up, he even mentions that they were seeing the same dream. This person asks in Part 6, how did FF contact Weather Report? And how did the rain not hurt FF if she still had the boiling water disc? Now for the first question, I simply have no idea what there is to be confused about. When Pucci went to retrieve the disc, we saw very clearly that FF had used one of the guards' radios hidden inside their body to contact weather. As for the boiling water stand, that happened when Pucci inserted the disc into a piece of FF that was closer to him. However, that piece and most of FF's body melted away, so they no longer have that stand by the time the rain starts. For the next one, we skip ahead to the moment when FF dies. This person asks why when FF dies, we see the inmate's soul leave their body, when this shouldn't happen since the inmate FF is inhabiting already died before. Now, I don't really understand the question here, since other than visually looking like the body FF uses, this soul has no connection whatsoever to the inmate Atro, who died back during FF's introduction. After all, this soul is clearly speaking as FF,
As
and
FF,
is
yeah.
clearly FF's soul. I guess their real question would be why FF's soul looks like the body,
like that,
not
yeah.
perhaps like the stand form of Foo Fighters. However, this was directly addressed in the scene. FF is a colony of plankton and arguably shouldn't even have a soul to begin with. But by gaining an intellect from the disc and living in one body, FF formed their own spirit. As FF says, even if Jolene were to get the Foo Fighters disc and recreate them, it would just be a different Foo Fighters, since the soul we're seeing here is the spirit of a unique individual. FF chose this body as their own, so their soul appears as the idealized version of themselves rather than the stand form they were before that point. Next is a topic I've actually gone over before, all the way back in my Part 6 debunking video. However, that was so long ago and I feel like many of my old
5 years
arguments don't
ago.
hold water. This one is related to the scene of Poochie first meeting Dio in the church, when Dio heals Poochie's deformed foot. Back then I argued that Dio healed this much like he had healed the wound of Vanilla Ice in Part 3 by using his blood. However, as many people have pointed out, this doesn't really make sense since Vanilla Ice was revived as a vampire after this while
Yeah.
Poochie is still human.
Yeah. The blood turned him into a vampire, didn't it? Hence, not being able to, like, go into the sun and that, but yeah, no.
Beyond that, I also just don't see how this would work, since I'm not sure Poochie's foot would even count as an injury to be healed in this way. But I do think there's a much better explanation here, which has to do with the powers we've seen vampiric beings use in the series. Vampires, as well as zombies and pillarmen, seem to have varying levels of control over flesh. What I mean by that is that they seem to be able to manipulate other people's bodies
Yes.
in ways that otherwise wouldn't be possible. For example, when Dio first encountered a vampire, it was able to very
Yeah, that was
easily
weird.
stick its hands into his neck and suck out his blood. But after this, there didn't seem to be any wound left behind, so it seems like vampires are sort of able to merge with the bodies of their victims. Similarly, the zombie Jack the Ripper was able to hide his body inside of a horse while the horse's
Yeah, that was
body
weird.
somehow remained mostly intact. The Pillarmen also had a similar power, although theirs was clearly more potent, where Santana could merge flesh with his own and inhabit other people's bodies, while managing to even keep them alive during this process. Wamu was able to merge together the hands of the Nazi soldiers before draining their life force all
yeah.
at once. This mastery over flesh may also be the method that Dio used to graft together the body parts of animals and humans, which he was shown doing in Part 1, and the power he ultimately used to attach his own head to Jonathan's body. So I believe the scene of Dio manipulating Poochie's foot is a very similar case, where he was able to merge his hands with Poochie's foot and rearrange it into its normal shape.
I could buy that.
For our next one, this person points out an inconsistency with how fate is portrayed in the series. They say that back in the Bites the Dust arc, it was shown that events are able to play out differently across time loops, but later were shown in the Heaven universe, minor events and actions like the guard tripping are still shown to be predetermined. On the contrary, I'd say that both of these scenes actually show the opposite. In the Bites the Dust arc, we see clearly that certain events will always happen no matter what. There's the fated deaths of Rohan and the others, of course, but also things like the teapot breaking, which happen regardless of changes
Every
made
single
by
time,
Hayato.
yeah.
We're directly shown that while Hayato can make smaller changes to fate, that doesn't actually change what ultimately happens. It's only when Kira himself messed up and revealed his identity that a major change occurred. And in the Part 6 example, unlike the comment says, we see that not everything is set in stone. The guard tripping was an event predetermined to happen, but as we can see later, minor deviations can occur. Emporio is fated to run to the ghost room, but the way he gets there can change. When he tries to avoid going there, which is a major deviation from fate, something happens that forces him down the fated path. And it's only when Poochie intervenes that fate changes, since he's exempt from the ability, just like what happened with Kira. So really, these two scenarios are very similar, showing that minor changes are possible, but major fated events will always happen regardless, unless the one in control of fate intervenes. Now we move on to Part 7, with this comment asking why Diego and Wekapipo
Well, that is... Yep. Cool. I love how he talks about things sometimes. Just so funny, because he's got such a casual voice, and then it's just like... really subtle, you know, because it's explained on the page here. Like, and we're well aware that this person's memory isn't that great. It's like, oh, goddamn. Shots fired, everybody get down. But yeah, that was cool to see. I look forward to more videos. Well done hitting 300,000 subscribers. That's absolutely fantastic, Hammer Beat. And I look forward to seeing what is next. And yeah, thank you all for watching.